Picture this. By the time you finish watching this video, approximately 60 people will have been displaced from their homes because of climate-related disasters. That's one person every 20 seconds. Over the past decade, weather-related events have forced 218 million people to move within their own countries. That's roughly the entire population of Brazil, uprooted and searching for safer ground. But here's what keeps world leaders and security experts awake at night. This isn't just a humanitarian crisis unfolding in distant lands. Climate migration is rapidly becoming the defining challenge of our generation, fundamentally reshaping borders, igniting new conflicts, exposing dangerous gaps in how our world handles people in crisis. The question isn't whether climate migration will transform our planet, it's whether we're prepared for what's already begun. So what exactly is climate migration? It's when people are forced to leave their homes because the environment around them becomes unlivable. We're talking about rising seas swallowing entire islands, devastating droughts turning farmland into desert, extreme hurricanes destroying communities year after year, and heat so intense that cities become death traps. Unlike traditional refugees fleeing war or persecution, climate migrants exist in a troubling legal gray zone. There's no comprehensive international framework to protect them. No official refugee status, no guaranteed rights or safe passage. The numbers are staggering. In 2023 alone, climate-related disasters played a role in forcing 26.4 million people from their homes worldwide. That's more than twice the population of Belgium on the move in just 12 months. And this crisis is accelerating faster than most people realize. The World Bank estimates that between 44 million and 216 million people will be forced to migrate within their own countries by 2050 because of climate change. Some researchers believe the real number could reach 500 million. When we account for everything, sudden floods and hurricanes, cross-border movements, and the slow-burning destruction of droughts and rising temperatures, this isn't science fiction. This isn't something happening in some distant future we can afford to ignore. This is happening right now, today, as you watch this. And it's about to become the most explosive geopolitical issue of our time, challenging everything we think we know about borders, citizenship, and our responsibilities to each other in an interconnected world. Let's break down exactly where this crisis is hitting hardest. Because the numbers tell a story most people never hear. Sub-Saharan Africa is facing the worst of it. Projections show up to 86 million people could be displaced internally by 2050. Water is disappearing. Deserts are expanding, and crops are failing across massive regions. Millions are already abandoning rural villages, flooding into overcrowded cities or desperately crossing borders, seeking survival. South Asia could see 40 million internal climate migrants. Bangladesh is particularly vulnerable, caught between two nightmares: violent cyclones that destroy everything in their path, and slower killers like saltwater creeping into farmland, poisoning the soil and making it impossible to grow food. The capital city Dhaka is bursting at the seams with people fleeing environmental destruction. East Asia and the Pacific face 49 million displaced. Latin America, 17 million. North Africa, 19 million. Eastern Europe and Central Asia, 5 million. But here's what most news reports miss entirely. Climate migration isn't random, and it doesn't affect everyone equally. Recent research reveals something surprising. The poorest people often can't afford to move at all. While the wealthiest can adapt their homes and lifestyles without relocating, it's the people in the middle. Families with just enough resources to leave, but not enough to comfortably stay and adapt, who migrate most often. And there's something even darker happening that researchers call involuntary immobility. Studies suggest that emigration among the poorest populations will actually be 10% lower in 2100 under climate change, compared to a world without warming. Why would fewer people move during a crisis? Because disasters and crop failures drain the exact financial resources families need to relocate. Moving costs money, transportation, housing deposits, starting over somewhere new. When climate change destroys your livelihood, it simultaneously destroys your ability to escape. Think about that cruel trap. People aren't just losing their homes to floods and droughts, they're losing their escape route. They become prisoners in places that can no longer sustain human life, watching conditions deteriorate around them, unable to afford the journey to safety. These are the invisible victims of climate change, the people we don't count because they haven't moved. They're stuck, and their numbers are growing. Now let's talk about the places where climate migration is creating the biggest political explosions. Start with the Pacific Islands, because these aren't just countries facing displacement. These are entire nations staring at extinction. Tuvalu's average elevation is just 2 meters above sea level. Most people live even lower than that. It's the highest point in the entire country. 5 meters. It's about as tall as a single-story house. In 2015, waves from tropical cyclone Pam reached 4 to 5 meters high, meaning the ocean temporarily rose higher than the islands themselves. This isn't a future threat. People are already watching their country disappear beneath the waves. Tuvalu negotiated something unprecedented with Australia, called the Gallipoli Union. This agreement allows up to 280 Tuvaluans per year to gain permanent residency in Australia. With Tuvalu's total population just over 11,000 people, simple math shows the entire nation could relocate within 40 years. But here's the controversial twist. The agreement includes security clauses requiring Tuvalu to consult Australia on all military and security partnerships. Some critics see it as trading sovereignty for survival, a desperate bargain that hints at the future for vulnerable nations. Kiribati chose a different path. In 2014, the government spent $9 million purchasing land in Fiji, theoretically enough to house all 100,000 citizens. They call it migration with dignity. But reality is complicated. The land is mountainous, marshy, and already inhabited. No one has actually moved there yet. Building the infrastructure to support an entire transplanted nation would cost hundreds of millions more that Kiribati doesn't have. In Africa, climate change is multiplying existing conflicts. Darfur suffered prolonged droughts in expanding deserts that intensified deadly competition between herders, needing grazing land and farmers protecting crops. Around Lake Chad, the lake has shrunk dramatically, destroying fishing communities and creating desperation that extremist groups like Boko Haram exploit for recruitment. South Asia is perhaps the most dangerous flashpoint. The India-Bangladesh border is one of the world's most militarized. Bangladesh faces severe flooding and coastal erosion, pushing people toward cities and across borders. India increasingly frames these movements as security threats, leading to more border militarization and growing anti-migrant violence. This is what analysts mean by climate migration as a geopolitical hotspot. It's not just humanitarian. It's potentially explosive. So where's the international response? Where are the treaties, the legal protections, the global systems to handle millions of climate migrants? Here's the uncomfortable answer. They basically don't exist. The current legal definition of a refugee was established way back in 1951, created in the aftermath of World War II. It covers people fleeing persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Climate change, not mentioned. Environmental disasters, not covered. Rising seas, not on the list. In July 2024, a U.S. federal court specifically denied an asylum claim based on climate change, ruling that climate refugees don't constitute a particular social group under existing law. The closest protection available in the United States is something called temporary protected status. It's offered to nationals of countries experiencing environmental disasters. But notice that word, temporary. It's not permanent protection or a pathway to citizenship. What about the United Nations climate negotiations, where world leaders gather every year? Researchers analyzed 513 priority adaptation projects, 229 projects from the Adaptation Fund, and 2,459 climate projects in the Global Environment Facilities database. Exactly 0 had titles indicating they specifically support climate migrants. The recently created Loss and Damage Fund mentions displacement, but it also mentions a dozen other priorities. Climate migrants are essentially an afterthought. Humanitarian aid agencies do support some climate migrants, but they're increasingly overwhelmed and underfunded. Climate finance mechanisms, the billions of dollars pledged for climate action, largely ignore human mobility entirely. It's a stunning gap. Some countries are experimenting with solutions. New Zealand offers limited migration access to Pacific nations through a special lottery system. But we're talking about just 75 spots per year for Kiribati and Tuvalu combined. The Marshall Islands has visa-free entry to the United States through a special agreement. But without financial assistance, only wealthy families can afford to actually relocate and start over. These are tiny band-aids on a massive hemorrhage. The global refugee system already struggles with roughly 120 million people displaced by violence, a number that's tripled in just the last decade. That system is broken and overwhelmed. Simply adding millions of climate migrants would neither serve current refugees well, nor provide meaningful support to those fleeing environmental catastrophe. What's desperately needed is something entirely new, but international cooperation has rarely been harder to achieve. Behind every statistic about climate migration is a real human being making impossible choices. Let's talk about what this actually looks like on the ground. In Turkana County, Kenya, prolonged drought devastated food sources and increased deadly waterborne diseases. A 2023 assessment discovered something heartbreaking. 7% of households were child-headed, meaning children were raising children because parents had died or left searching for work. Of these households, approximately 1,622 had absolutely no relatives or community members nearby to help them. 8% had no regular or reliable support at all. These aren't just statistics about migration. These are children forced into adulthood by climate change, struggling to survive alone. In Uganda, extreme weather events caused over 200,000 deaths between 1900 and 1618. In May 2024 alone, catastrophic floods impacted 46,457 people and destroyed over 2,300 homes. 58% of those affected were working-age adults, the economic backbone of their communities, suddenly displaced with nothing. And this isn't just happening in developing countries. During the January 2025 Los Angeles fires, some of the wealthiest homeowners hired private firefighting crews to save their mansions while neighbors watched their homes burn. Climate adaptation, it turns out, is a luxury. Money determines who survives and who loses everything. This brings us back to involuntary immobility, the people we don't see because they can't leave. Smallholder farmers in Nepal face a cruel trap. When droughts destroy their crops, they can't afford the travel costs to migrate and find work elsewhere. They lose both their harvest and their economic safety net simultaneously. Research shows that by 2050, global warming will expose nearly all refugee camps worldwide to significantly more days of hazardous, potentially deadly heat. Some of the hottest locations could see twice as many dangerous heat days. And restrictive border policies are making everything worse. Analysis shows that when people can migrate internationally, they typically move to places with lower climate risk than where they came from. But when borders tighten and options disappear, people stay trapped in higher-risk areas. The very policies designed to control migration are actually increasing vulnerability to climate disasters. For small island nations facing complete relocation, there's loss you can't measure in statistics. It's about languages, traditions, cultural practices tied to specific places for thousands of years. Can a nation still exist if its territory disappears? Can culture survive being transplanted to foreign soil? No international law addresses these questions. So why should you care about climate migrants if you're sitting somewhere that feels safe, somewhere dry, somewhere stable? Let me give you 3 reasons that directly affect your life, no matter where you live. First, economics. In 2024 alone, floods caused over $120 billion in damages globally. Climate impacts don't just hurt the places where disasters strike. They disrupt global supply chains, devastate agricultural production, and shake labor markets worldwide. When millions of people are suddenly displaced, the economic ripple effects reach every corner of the planet. Your grocery prices, your job security, your investments are all connected to climate stability thousands of miles away. Second, security. NATO countries are currently debating whether to increase defense spending to 5% of their national budgets, but climate security experts are sounding the alarm. No amount of military spending can address the conflicts that climate change will unleash without serious climate action. Syria experienced a devastating drought from 2006 to 2010 that destroyed agriculture and pushed desperate people into cities, creating conditions that helped spark civil war. That pattern will repeat across the world as resources become scarce and people become desperate. Third, and most simply, because we're all connected. The carbon emissions driving climate change don't respect national borders. Neither will the people forced to flee its impacts. This is fundamentally a global problem that demands global solutions. But here's the genuinely good news. Solutions exist right now. We need a new international legal framework specifically designed for climate displacement. One that creates pathways for dignified, planned migration without overwhelming the existing refugee system. We need massive investment in climate adaptation in the most vulnerable regions, focusing on water resilience, food security, and rural development. These interventions work when properly funded. We need to fundamentally rethink how climate finance operates. The fact that zero UN climate adaptation projects specifically address human displacement is a policy failure we can fix tomorrow if there's political will. Most importantly, we need to change how we talk about this crisis. Climate migrants aren't invaders or threats. They're people showing extraordinary resilience in the face of a catastrophe they didn't create, often caused by emissions from countries far wealthier than their own. Climate migration will define the 21st century. The only question remaining is whether we'll respond with walls, in fear, or with planning, compassion, and the systems needed to protect human dignity in our rapidly changing world. The time to decide is right now, because by 2050, when hundreds of millions of people are on the move, it will be far too late to build what we need. The climate migrants of tomorrow are counting on the choices we make today.